I am the Philosophical Bachelor, and today I'm going to talk about the first chapter of the book by Albert Kamu, The Myth of Sisyphus, entitled Absurd Reasoning. The Myth of Sisyphus by Albert Kamu has 4 chapters, and within them there are sub-chapters. He does not number them, but I will do so in order that the listeners can know where we are in relation to the book. Section 1.1 Absurdity and Suicide. The most fundamental question is the one most urgently requiring investigation. For Kamu, the most fundamental question in philosophy is whether life is or is not worth living. He writes, "There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Whatever problems there are in philosophy, from metaphysics to epistemology, are of secondary importance, only worth answering after the primary question of whether life is worth living has been addressed. In contrast to that question, the rest are games, trivial compared to his question, which is literally a matter of life and death. While we may have an emotional response to the question, it remains unclear intellectually, which is why Kamu wants to analyze it. How do we know that this question is indeed the most important and urgent one? It is because of the outcomes or actions that its answer leads to. Kamu claims that he has not encountered anyone who has died for philosophical positions, such as the ontological argument for the existence of God. He cites the example of Galileo, who recanted his scientific findings that the Earth was not at the center of the universe the moment it posed a danger to his life. That truth was not worth the stake, writes Kamu. Whether the Earth revolved around the Sun or otherwise was a matter of profound indifference, a futile question, and hence was not worth dying for. It makes little difference to the average person's life the answer to such scientific questions, while many people die because they judge that life is not worth living. Others die for ideas that gave them a reason to live, which paradoxically then seem to be also worth sacrificing their lives over, whether they be true or false. He adds in a footnote that there are also those who commit suicide out of honor, citing the political suicides of protest during the Chinese Revolution. So there are 3 reasons that Kamu presents why people commit suicide. 1. It is not worth living. 2. Ideology. 3. Honor. Here, I think Kamu is making a rhetorical point. I'm not sure if he is factually right about people not dying over theories, or that his delineations do not overlap. I can think of examples of intellectuals who have died for truth, namely Socrates and Giordano Bruno. Bruno refused to recant his theories, which were deemed heretical, and was burnt at the stake, while Socrates took the hemlock poison, which was a sentence for impiety towards the gods and corrupting the youth of Athens. It was not for any specific philosophy that led to his execution, but a general animosity towards him, the slander and envy of many people. He could have easily escaped, hence making his death a kind of suicide. Socrates' suicide can however be considered a matter of honor or principle, fitting into Kamu's third category of honor suicides. Bruno's execution, while not a suicide, was not inevitable. He could have recanted the way Galileo did. He can be considered to have died for his ideas, Kamu's second category, though how this differs from Kamu's prior claim about no one dying for philosophical or scientific truth is thus contradicted if those truths are their ideas. Nonetheless, the fundamental nature of the question on whether to live or die remains valid. Kamu thinks that there are 2 approaches to answer the question, the methods of La Palisse and the method of Don Quixote. La Palisse is a military officer whose epitaph was erroneously recalled to be, "If he weren't dead, he would still be alive." The method of La Palisse, hence, is the method of truism, of tautology, which while being true illuminates nothing which was not already obvious. This harks back to Kamu's first category that many people die because they judge that life is not worth living. It is obvious that people commit suicide because they judge that life is not worth living, since they would otherwise have refrained. It is true, but gives no insight as to why they did it. We want to know why they did not find life worth living, which Kamu would explore in this book. Turning to the method of Don Quixote. Don Quixote is a character in the novel entitled Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes. Quixote is a knight who is misguided, who carries out various ridiculous actions, such as fighting against windmills, mistaking them for enemies which he had imagined. He is absurd because he behaves in an absurd way, though this is not to be confused with Camus' term, the absurd man. The absurd man for Camus is one who recognizes the absurdity of the human condition and yet lives on, accepting the absurdity. The absurd man is quite the opposite of absurd. He is lucid, that is, he is thinking clearly. Quixote, on the other hand, is deluded, which leads to absurd, ridiculous behaviors. This corresponds to Camus' second category of people who die for their ideas, which could be true ideas in the case of Bruno or illusions in the case of Quixote, which gave them a reason to live and hence also a reason to die. Kamu thinks that to approach such a topic such as suicide, we need to balance between evidence and lyricism to achieve emotion and lucidity, between a fact-based approach and an approach which draws from literature, which, while not factual, lends insight through fictional imaginings on the human condition. Drawing from both sources will allow us to have clear thinking about the matter, and yet capture our emotional response, which is not in the domain of facts but feelings. Kamu is explaining that our approach to the question of suicide should not be overly intellectual, but be tempered with common sense and understanding. I think that what Kamu is doing here is preparing his readers that this book is not some rigorous, tightly researched, and thoroughly cross-referenced academic paper. Instead, he is going to appeal to common sense intuitions and not try to prove every statement. I already pointed out the lack of rigor of the earlier pages of this chapter, though a generous reader would broadly take his point to be rhetorical and try to understand what he is trying to say, even if it is not watertight. Kamu observes that up to his time, suicide has only been dealt with as a social phenomenon, perhaps referring to sociologist Emile Durkheim's work on suicide. Kamu instead wants to tackle it on the level of the individual. He thinks this is needed since what leads to the act of suicide is prepared within the silence of the heart, in our unconscious self. Others may be able to see the final trigger, the last straw that broke the camel's back, but to properly understand the cause of suicide, we need to examine its beginnings in the heart of the victim and how these beginnings undermine the person. However, what is in our hearts is hidden, which makes the ultimate cause of suicide mostly unverifiable. Hence, Kamu abandons this approach to look instead at what the act of suicide implies for its victims. Killing yourself amounts to confessing that life is too much for you, or that you do not understand it, that it is not worth the trouble, he writes. He thinks that people may continue to live for several reasons, the first of which is habit. We carry on living because we are used to carrying on. We do the same things over and over again, not because they are the best, but out of inertia. Hence, when one breaks that pattern and rejects living, it means that one has recognized the ridiculous character of that habit, the absence of any profound reason for living, the insane character of that daily agitation and the uselessness of suffering, writes Kamu. Kamu suggests that such thoughts deprive us of the mindlessness, the sleep, the obliviousness that we need to simply carry on. Even if we only had inertia and other bad reasons to continue living, it at least is still a familiar world. It is when we lose these illusions that we feel alienated, estranged from the world. When we are beset with this sense that we live in an absurd world, we are unable to even look back and think that we have simply lost our way or have hope for a better future. He thinks we intuitively can understand these feelings of wanting to end it all without needing further explanation, since it is something all healthy men would have gone through. Hence, he is not investigating these feelings, but the relationship between the absurd and suicide. He wants to investigate how suicide can be a solution to the absurd. As already noted in my first video on the book, Kamu finally concludes that we can and should still live on even in our absurdity. I do not know if you have stumbled upon these series of videos on the myth of Sisyphus because of an existential despair and thoughts of suicide, but if that describes you, please know that Kamu is actually optimistic towards life, though he wants to explore the topic without initially assuming a position. He is not writing a polemic that is an ode to life. Instead, he wants to remain open and struggle with the issue wherever it leads him. I hope his exploration finally encourages you to carry on living, and please seek help directly if you need it. Kamu proposes an axiom. An intellectually honest person will allow what he believes to determine his action. Hence, belief in the absurdity of existence must then dictate his conduct. One way to carry on living and make peace with ourselves is to forsake our realization that we live in an absurd world or find other ways of escape intellectually. That is not the path Kamu chooses. To him, that will be a philosophical suicide. If the question of suicide is framed logically, to exhaust all possibilities, there are only 3 possibilities. 1. Yes. 2. No. And 3. Those who continue to seek answers. However, despite how we may theorize and use our rationality to try to find answers, it is not just a matter for rationality. Even if we conclude that life is not worth living, the body's judgment is as good as the mind's, and the body shrinks from annihilation, he writes. Our intellect and rationality may tell us one thing, but our bodies have their own wishes. There is a strong innate drive in our physical beings that want to survive. We get into the habit of living before acquiring the habit of thinking, writes Kamu. The body's inclinations are ahead of the intellect's, and the body wants to live. This leads us to avoid death. Some avoid death through having a hope of an afterlife, while some live for a great idea that transcends their life, that gives it meaning and beauty, which might finally lead them to sacrifice their lives in service to this great idea. Both groups evade the living of life simply for its own sake. They do this because it seems that if life has no meaning, it is not worth living. Kamu, however, believes that this is a non sequitur, that is, the conclusion does not follow from the premises. It does not follow that just because life is absurd and meaningless, we need to escape it, doing so through false hopes, illusions, or suicide. Kamu thinks that we need to tackle the topic rationally, logically, though he thinks that whatever conclusion logic brings us, people who kill themselves do so not out of logical considerations, but out of their emotions. Nonetheless, Kamu wants to examine if there is a logic, a reasoning that indeed leads people to suicide. He suggests that such a journey may bring us to the limits of our reason, but we need to remain at these limits to see how absurdity, hope and death dialogue with one another. Section 1.2 Absurd Walls. Deep feelings always mean more than they are conscious of saying, writes Kamu. Feelings cannot be entirely expressed in words, and so we never really know a person since we cannot get inside a person to feel what he feels. Even if he describes his feelings, it will be inadequate since language is inadequate to the task. While we cannot get at what is inside him, we can observe what he manifests externally. We can observe his behavior, actions, and its outcomes. Kamu is proposing a method to analyze the human condition. A person defines himself by his belief on who he is and his sincere impulses, though we do not know these feelings. Part of these beliefs and feelings are disclosed by the person's actions and attitudes. However, this method is one of analysis and not of knowledge. We cannot achieve true knowledge of the person under study. All we can perceive are appearances. This notion is similar to Immanuel Kant's conclusion that all we know are representations and never the thing in itself, and Kamu may have borrowed it from him. Kamu is certainly aware of Kant since it was Kant's formulation of categories in the Critique of Pure Reason that Kamu points to as an example of an unimportant philosophical question at the opening of the book. All great deeds and all great thoughts have a ridiculous beginning, Kamu writes. He suggests that we first receive an inkling of these deeds and thoughts suddenly, in liminal moments such as when going through a restaurant's revolving door. We go through our routines out of habit for months and years, when suddenly in our weariness born from tedium, we begin to wonder why we do it. A Heideggerian anxiety arises in us, which is the origin of the absurd. We live in anticipation of the future and then realize we have missed the present. Weariness comes at the end of the acts of our mechanical life, but at the same time it inaugurates the impulse of consciousness, Kamu writes. We can either awaken or fall back into our routine. If we choose to awaken, we might be led to despair and suicide, or we might recover from it and live on, but this time armed with our realization of an absurd world. Kamu next describes what Sartre had called nausea, when a strangeness overtakes us when we see things as they are, without the filters of meaning that we had hitherto interpreted them with. Kamu talks about how we see a stone, previously familiar but now foreign and irreducible to what we have previously understood of it from our theories and from our familiarity with stones. Everything changes. We look at our surroundings, such as the sky, hills, and trees, and they all become unfamiliar, different from how we had previously perceived them. That stage scenery, masked by habit, becomes again what it is, he writes. The props on a stage which we had previously accepted to be lakes and woods are simply representations drawn for instance on hard cardboard. It is like seeing the world with fresh eyes instead of our usual eyes which have been desensitized by our familiarity with it. I experienced this when I returned to a space which I previously spent a lot of time in. I was working in a particular office, and after moving to a new one, returned to visit it some months later, and it felt like a different place. Previously I belonged. I had my desk, the people there knew me. Now I did not belong. I did not know the people there. I felt like an intruder. I go to my former desk to find a stranger sitting where I used to sit. Another time, after I emptied my home of my belongings because I was shifting, it likewise became an alien place for me, lacking its previous warm familiarity. I did not know it anymore, even though I had lived there for over 20 years. The place had not changed, the walls remained the same, but stripped of my pictures that used to adorn those walls. The space now empty and echoey, without my dining table, without the sofa I spent many hours in, and the bed where I rested every night. The place was no longer familiar. It felt as alien, perhaps even more alien than a new place, since there is an expectation of familiarity which is now gone, making the sense of alienation even deeper by contrast. That strangeness of the world is the absurd, explains Kamu. He gives further examples where in our moments of lucidity, the everyday appears ridiculous. He sees a man talking on a phone in a phone booth where he cannot hear him. It was as if the man was acting out a silly pantomime. In today's context, imagine seeing someone alone and talking to herself, gesticulating. She is actually on her mobile phone using a wireless earpiece, not realizing how bizarre she appears to one who did not make that connection. This feeling of nausea, of absurdity, is when you look in a mirror or at photographs and do not recognize yourself, according to Kamu. Kamu turns to the topic of death. Many have died, but no one has ever experienced it that is not dead. We can only have experiences if we are conscious, and the dead is not conscious. We have heard accounts of death, we have seen people dying, but these are only a weak substitute for the actual experience of what death feels like, which no one alive has ever had. No code of ethics and no effort are justifiable a priori in the face of the cruel mathematics that command our condition, he writes. This cruel mathematics refers to the limited span of time we have to live. In the face of an impending death, which Kamu presumes to be final without any afterlife, nothing seems to make sense. Making sense of things is a compulsion for our mental faculties. However, when we reflect on thinking itself, we find contradictions. Firstly, when we understand the world, what we are doing is reducing it to our human understanding. We are interpreting the phenomena. The way animals look at the world differs from us. We are not understanding the world as it is. To understand is above all to unify, according to Kamu. Yet when the mind asserts total unity, it stands outside of this unity as one looking at the unity, and hence proves that there is no unity. There is a hiatus between what we fancy we know and what we really know. Practical assent and simulated ignorance, which allows us to live with ideas which, if we truly put them to the test, ought to upset our whole life, he writes. This gives rise to a skepticism, though this skepticism is not total. We have privileged access to our feelings, and so we know that they exist. We also use our senses to contact the world, and hence judge that it exists. There ends all my knowledge, and the rest is construction, he writes. We can grasp aspects of objects, but we cannot simply then add up all these aspects and think that we know the object completely. The object is more than the sum of its aspects. This applies also to us as objects. This very heart which is mine will forever remain indefinable to me. I shall be a stranger to myself, writes Kamu. We can have many small truths in the aspects we decipher, but we have no overarching truth where we can know the thing in itself. Even science cannot give capital T truth to us. Scientists describe and classify the world, coming up with laws that describes its behavior, reducing things to the atoms that form them. Kamu expounds, but you tell me of an invisible planetary system in which electrons gravitate around a nucleus. You explain this world to me with an image. I realize then that you have been reduced to poetry. So that science that was to teach me everything ends up in a hypothesis, that lucidity founders in metaphor. The foundations of science are not as solid as we expect, and while our scientific knowledge has moved on from his time, mysteries still lie at the heart of the scientific endeavor. Science can describe phenomena, count and categorize them, but we still do not understand the world. Were I to trace the world's entire relief with my finger, I should not know any more, he asserts. Even if we touch a thing all over with our hands and look at it from every angle, we still do not really know the thing in itself. There is no certainty. You give me the choice between a description that is sure but that teaches me nothing, and hypotheses that claim to teach me but that are not sure, he writes. We crave certainty and understanding, but because we cannot have it, it seems that to be at peace with ourselves, we can only stifle our thinking process or refuse to know. Indeed, that is the conclusion of the skeptics from ancient Greece, but Kamu is being ironic here. He is not a skeptic. It is not that we are unable to have any knowledge. For him, our intellect leads us to the knowledge that the world is absurd. We know that the world is absurd. The knowledge that the world is absurd is knowledge. An unease and sense of absurdity arises in us because we want to make sense of senselessness. We long for clarity. On this plane of the intellect, there is no happiness if I cannot know, he says. He thinks that our attempts at knowledge are laughable. We instead have to recognize that the world is not reasonable. Not everything can be rationally understood. What makes the world absurd is when we insist on it being reasonable, being amenable to our faculty of reasoning when it is not. The absurd depends as much on man as on the world. It is the confrontation of the irrational with the wild longing for clarity that makes the world and us absurd. How can Todd survive in an absurd world? From the moment absurdity is recognized, it becomes a passion, the most harrowing of all, Kamu writes. The question, however, is whether and how we can cope with these feelings of absurdity, since passion burn the heart they simultaneously exalt. Our passions have a power to arouse great emotions in us and to elevate us, but do we allow this sense of absurdity to destroy us or to awaken us to new possibilities? Man has been torn between his urge towards unity and the clear vision he may have of the walls enclosing him, writes Kamu. He examined how earlier philosophers who, like him, have realized the absurdity of the world, have critiqued rationality and attempt to tackle the absurd. I think Kamu is simply pointing out that he is not the first to think of the absurd world and is part of an existing tradition which he is now extending. These paragraphs are interesting though fragmentary since it deals with it in greater detail in the next section, so I will skip ahead to the part on Husserl and phenomenology because Kamu is sympathetic to the project of phenomenology. Science and philosophy typically try to discover transcendent principles to unify phenomena. Phenomenology takes a new approach, instead describing the phenomena as it is, suspending presuppositions and theories, in a move known as the transcendental reduction. As theories come and go, our understanding of the phenomena changes accordingly if our understanding of it is theory-laden, while the fact is that reality has not changed. All that has changed is our interpretation through the lenses of the varying theories. Instead, phenomenology is aiming for a correct description of the object as it appears, since appearance is all we can know of the object. Phenomenology does not assume that the object's appearance is its reality, a move known as the phenomenological reduction. Through the phenomenological method, thinking ceases to be unifying or making a semblance familiar in the guise of a major principle. Thinking is learning all over again to see, to be attentive, to focus consciousness. It is turning every idea and every image into a privileged moment, Kamu explains. Phenomenology in this way is the procedure for the absurd man. Kamu will return to Husserl in the next section. To sum up what connects these thinkers, Kamu writes, these men vie with one another in proclaiming that nothing is clear, all is chaos, that all man has is his lucidity and his definite knowledge of the walls surrounding him. There are limits to our understanding and we are confronted with an absurd world. We experience anguish in the Heideggerian sense because we long to be able to make sense of the world. The absurd is born of this confrontation between the human need to make sense of the world and the unreasonable silence of the world, he writes. I shall call this his equation of the absurd, which we can schematically consider as the absurd equals human need to make sense of the world plus unreasonableness of the world. Given these conditions, what can we do?